There's been a fair amount of attention paid to climate issues in this federal campaign, and the campaign platforms certainly have extensive planks about climate, but there are other environment and energy related issues as well. And I'm going to talk to Sharon Mascher, who's in the law faculty at the University of Calgary, about some of those. So welcome to the interview, Sharon.
Thank you.
Look, what's your take then on other issues that we should be discussing, or the leaders and parties should be discussing?
Well, I guess the parties are discussing a lot of issues outside of climate change, although they're interconnected with climate change, of course, in their platforms, but other environmental issues haven't really got the airtime because obviously climate change is a pressing enough matter that it's preoccupied the conversation. I think that's legitimate, but I think there's some other important concerns that Canadians should be paying attention to.
Now, coal is big in Alberta, where you're located. What's your take on that? And what should the federal parties? How should they be talking about it?
So that coal is an excellent example of something that Albertans should be paying attention to. I mean, obviously we have the coal committee considering the Alberta coal policy right now at the provincial level, but federally these big projects should involve impact assessment at the federal level. The way the Impact Assessment Act is currently drafted, that's not necessarily the case. So it's important to hear from federal parties whether they will use their impact assessment, the impact assessment legislation, to ensure that considerations of impacts on fisheries and water, etc., are considered as it's within their power to do.
What about on the energy side? That's always of interest in the prairies. In particular, and especially because we keep hearing that peak oil demand is no more than a decade away, may only be a few years to 5 years away. So what about energy issues?
Well, so I mean, this is one of those areas where there's definitely a interaction between climate policies and other environmental policies. The extent to which there are ambitious targets necessarily affects how energy development is going to proceed within Canada. And on that front, I think that the ambition of the various parties' targets has been well rehearsed. The Conservative government would take us backwards, and the Liberal government's ratcheting up ambition a little bit from the Harper government commitment, and the other parties are going a little bit further. How that plays out underneath and what the effects are for the energy sector is a really interesting conversation, and it comes back to our climate accountability legislation that was passed just before the Senate, one of the last things that the Senate dealt with before the end of the last session. And one of the issues that environmental organizations were pushing was the need to have carbon budgets. As currently enacted, that is not how the legislation reads. There's a commitment to ongoing carbon plans, which the Liberals say is the same thing, but carbon budgets will actually set a trajectory for how emissions are allocated across sectors going forward. And so the NDP is talking about sectoral budgets, which is an important issue for the energy sector.
Well, you're quite right. I mean, climate keeps bleeding into these discussions. It's almost unavoidable, and here we are doing it again. But let's talk about the Liberals' oil and gas emissions cap. Because I interviewed policy analyst Seth Klein, and he said that it's kind of like a carbon budget. And you mentioned the NDP have, but I'm curious. Now you're a law professor. How might that emissions cap and annual reductions that Trudeau promised, how might that be implemented?
Well, I mean, it's a very good question, but I think under the existing Canadian Environmental Protection Act, GHGs, CO2 are listed as toxic substances. There's plenty of experience with regulation directed at regulating those toxic substances. So I think that there is the ability right there. I have no doubt it would be the subject of some controversy with the province in relation to division of powers, but I think it's clearly situated there within the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, and there is room to regulate that sector. I mean, if you remember, the Harper government, who was very anti-carbon price, was very pro-regulation, and they promised to regulate sector by sector. And that would have included the oil and gas sector. We just never seem to get to those regulations.
So we've talked about coal, we've talked about oil and gas. What other kinds of environmental or energy issues should we be talking about, do you think?
Well, there's some important international commitments to how much land and water is set aside in order to address what is without a doubt a significant biodiversity crisis. And so we do see most of the parties being prepared to step up to the international 30% targets that are set to set aside land and water. The Liberals are ratcheting up to that from a current 25%. The NDP are at 30%. The Conservative platform, though, brings us back again, revisits targets that are unrealized from the past. So again, as with, I guess, is sort of the overarching theme of these various platforms, it's less ambitious on that front. And then another thing I think that's really important part of the Canadian conversation is environmental justice. Environmental justice can be translated into the energy transition, just transition conversation, but it is also about recognizing that we continue in Canada to impose environmental costs and harms on particular disadvantaged communities to the benefit of other communities, and commitments to further that conversation from the New Democratic Party platform is important. I think it's an important part of this conversation. The other major parties are talking about furthering Indigenous governance, Indigenous relationships, but that environmental justice conversation certainly includes Indigenous peoples, but it goes further than that. And it's something that Canada has to grapple with in these coming years.
Yeah, I thought the discussion around just transition has been really skewed because I understand what the Liberals came out with a couple of pieces of legislation or promises of legislation and said, look, we're going to help displaced workers, communities, Indigenous communities, that sort of thing. But the industry, the oil and gas industry, and Premier Kenny and Energy Minister Sonia Savage interpret just transition to mean dismantling the oil and gas industry. And so it's kind of a fundamental misunderstanding. Any insights into where the Conservative Party's platform lands on just transition?
Well, the Conservative Party is really focused on, I think, facilitating the status quo. And so their focus is more on offering ways forward with carbon capture, for example, that mean that there is a way forward for the energy sector to address climate change while still not actually embracing the need to transition away to different ways of doing things. And so I think that's a point of departure for sure between the Conservative platform and that of the other major parties.
Well, Sharon, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate your insights.
Pleasure.